Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the White House at 50 years old, and he wouldn't leave it until he died 13 years later. Oops, sorry, spoiler alert. FDR is undoubtedly one of the most important presidents in American history. He had risen up through the ranks of New York politics until he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, a position that was also held by his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. Oh, hey, Teddy, we're still talking about you. But that wasn't the only connection he had to TR. He also married Teddy's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. So Eleanor didn't even have to change her last name, which was pretty feminist of her. Now, just to dispel this ongoing rumor, no, Franklin and Eleanor were not closely related. It wasn't incest. They were like fifth cousins once removed, which means their common ancestor was their fourth great-grandparents. But they both still had the distinguished Roosevelt name, and they did know each other growing up in the same political circles, so. In 1921, just after running as the vice presidential candidate against Warren Harding, FDR contracted polio and had to retreat from politics. He all but disappeared from the public eye for most of the decade, except for the work done by his wife Eleanor to keep him in everyone's minds. With Eleanor's help and support, he decided to re-enter politics, although he kept his diagnosis and lack of mobility as quiet as possible. In 1928, as Hoover was getting elected president, FDR became the governor of New York, just like Uncle Teddy. And 4 years later, he won the presidency in a landslide, promising a new deal for the American people. Now, when he became president, most of the banks across the country were closed, and 1 in 4 workers were unemployed. In his first inaugural speech, he famously told the crowd,
"Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
Now, if Hoover tried, then FDR really tried. He didn't enter the White House with a specific ideology, but he told his cabinet members, above all, try something. The New Deal is kind of like the government just throwing money and acronyms at a wall and seeing which ones stick. Now, FDR was faced with a few options, and he intentionally surrounded himself with advisors who disagreed with each other in the hopes of finding a decent compromise. Should the government continue what Hoover had been doing, work with businesses to try to regulate wages and production like maybe they would in wartime? Or were businesses the problem, and they should be broken up and regulated? Or maybe should the government just take over and run parts of the economy itself? That wasn't off the table, considering that democratic socialism was on the rise in Europe at the same time. Now, FDR took it step by step, but he took those steps really fast. Instead of attending inaugural balls, he called his advisors in to start writing legislation the day he moved into the White House. In his first 100 days in office, Congress passed 15 major acts of legislation. That's insane. And these acts collectively became known as the first New Deal. Now, I could go into detail about all the agencies and administrations and recovery organizations created under the New Deal, but I don't want to, and you don't want me to either, trust me. So I'm going to take you through some of the highlights, especially the parts of the New Deal that still impact our world today. Now, FDR's first challenge was to save the banks. There were plenty of banks out there that were okay, but no one knew which ones they could trust anymore. So on his second day in office, he declared a banking holiday, because that sounds way less scary than literally closing down every bank in the country, so that his officials could survey each bank and decide which ones were financially sound enough to reopen. He explained all of this using the radio in his famous weekly fireside chats. You should really go listen to them. They're all up on YouTube. But FDR was incredibly effective at communicating to the public. He spoke plainly and openly about what the government was doing and why the best thing that citizens could do in this first week would be to calm down and put their money back into the secure banks so the economy could slowly get to work again. And they did. When the banks reopened after the 4-day holiday, people were lined up around the blocks not to take their money out, but to put their money back into the banks. After this Band-Aid, he went on to pass more long-term fixes like the Securities Act, which created the SEC to regulate the stock market, and the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which separated commercial banking, the everyday banking that you and I do, with riskier investment banking so that they couldn't be mixed anymore. This also created the FDIC to ensure bank deposits and increase confidence in the banking system. This on its own was a massive increase of regulation and federal power. After getting the banks stabilized, he wanted to focus on individuals who were struggling. He created an organization to buy up people's mortgages who were late on their payments, restructure their loans, and lower their interest rates. The Farm Credit Administration gave farmers money to refinance their mortgages at lower rates, and all of this is brand new. The idea that the federal government would step in and directly help individuals pay their mortgage was unheard of. But FDR went even further. In the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the government paid farmers to not produce certain livestock or crops. Let me say that again. Over 2 years, the government gave farmers over $1 billion to not farm. It was supposed to help get supply down on certain products, but that also meant that prices went up, which made people, not happy. Also, paying farmers not to farm feels a little weird, right? The Supreme Court eventually struck down the AAA as an overreach of federal power. Now, the last step of his first New Deal, remember these first 100 days in office, was to get people working. He created a ton of organizations, all with different acronyms, but the gist was that the federal government hired mostly young men to build infrastructure and complete other public works projects that the government made up for them. It's kind of like if you're a parent and you just make up a random chore for your kid to do so that you can give them an allowance, but with the entire nation. The most famous of these early organizations was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. Men worked for 6 to 12 months at a time, planting trees, building reservoirs, and generally improving the environment, especially in the Midwest that had been ravaged by dust storms. Of the $30 that they made each month, 25 of that was sent directly home to their families. And while they were working, these men were given food and shelter and taught to read and write if they didn't already know how. Ironically, over 80,000 Native Americans were employed by the CCC, helping a bunch of white dudes try to undo all the damage that had been done to the land since it had been taken from them. Other agencies built parks, playgrounds, airports, roads, anything the government could justify as necessary infrastructure to pay people to work. One program alone spent $1 billion in 5 months. So, did it work? It depends on who you ask. The real goal of the first New Deal was to stop further decline, and it did that. But most of the government jobs were temporary, and even though the government created 2 million jobs, there were still 10 million people unemployed. What the first New Deal did really well was inspire hope and restore faith in the nation. People calmed down and at least felt like there might be a light at the end of this tunnel. And in a sign that he maybe did find a pretty decent compromise, almost everyone found something wrong with it. Left-wing Democrats felt like it hadn't gone far enough. They wanted more direct redistribution of wealth and power from the rich to the middle class and the poor. Like in 1936, FDR was faced with some primary challengers who campaigned on ideas like nationalizing the entire banking system or just directly paying citizens over 60 a pension. Although none of those candidates had a real chance, some of those policies mobilized new voting blocs for the Democrats, especially retirees for the first time. On the other side, conservatives felt like this was way too far and put way too much regulation on businesses that would now never be able to build themselves back up. And they were also really concerned about FDR's deficit spending, meaning he just abandoned the idea that we needed a balanced budget and just borrowed money to pay for programs we needed right then. Like, we'll figure out how to pay it back later when we're not in a crisis. And there were some cases in which the Supreme Court agreed that FDR had overstepped. In 1935, a few of his agencies were struck down as unconstitutional, and FDR became afraid that his whole first New Deal might fall apart. He needed to keep moving fast to get as much legislation passed before he lost his momentum and his support and, at the time, possibly the 1936 election. So in 1935, FDR demanded that Congress come in over the summer and told them they couldn't go home until they passed his new bills. This second New Deal went beyond just trying to stop the decline of the Depression, but it looked into the future to try to build a stronger economy and build social safety nets to prevent collapses like this one in the future. The Works Progress Administration was the largest public works program of the New Deal, spending $11 billion to build 650,000 miles of road, 125,000 public buildings, 124,000 bridges, 8,000 parks. Look up the WPA sites in your city. I guarantee there are a few that you know. Personally, my favorite part of the WPA is Federal Project Number 1. Despite its less than creative name, it was a government program to finance artists, musicians, writers, and actors to create. They were paid by the federal government to write plays and paint murals and set up orchestras. Remember Aaron Douglas, the black muralist that I love? He was paid as part of the WPA. And this is an amazing moment where the government is recognizing the power of art to lift people up in critical times. Even more amazing, in my opinion, is the effort within this project to send people across the country to record the stories of people who had been born enslaved. Recognizing that the last generation of Black Americans who had been born into bondage were quickly dying off, the government funded the Slave Narrative Project, which went on to collect more than 2,300 first-person accounts from previously enslaved Americans. A few other groundbreaking acts included the Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively. It also established the National Labor Relations Board to oversee factory elections, to investigate employers accused of unfair practices, and to arbitrate disputes. And all of this led to a burst of union activity, empowered by the show of support from the government. Union membership tripled in the 1930s from 3 to 9 million. I mean, FDR himself was quoted as saying, "If I went to work in a factory, the first thing I'd do would be to join a union." Think about how far we've come from the era of the Haymarket riot and government-funded strikebreakers. But the most famous and long-lasting action taken as part of the New Deal, and the one you've probably heard of, was the Social Security Act. This was a precedent-breaking piece of legislation that created the first entitlement program in American history. Basically, it's not welfare or temporary relief, but it's a payment that all Americans are entitled to, guaranteed by the government, because they pay into it during their working years. This was a long-term safety net that told American workers the government would have their back when it was time for them to retire. FDR's administration slowed down on creating new New Deal programs as Republicans won more seats in Congress. But what we still need to talk about is, what did the New Deal mean? What was its legacy? And why is it still incredibly important, regardless of your opinions on it, to understand today? Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.